Welcome to this class. In this class, we are going to talk about retroperitoneum and the posterior abdominal wall. Ideally, this class comes perhaps after you've already talked about anatomy of the anterior abdominal wall, and you've also talked about anatomy of the digestive system. So you somewhat have an idea the abdominal organs which have digestive functions. You also have an idea about the organization of the anterior abdominal wall. Also, you have an idea regarding what we call peritoneum, although we'll talk about again in this lecture. And so if that is there, then it could be easier for you to then talk about the retroperitoneum and the posterior abdominal wall. This lecture ideally comes before you then talk about the anatomy of the urinary system, which is most likely the next topic. So in this particular lecture, we are going to focus on a number of things. The first one will be to explain the organization of the peritoneal layer, the organization of the peritoneum. After we've done that, then we are going to state the difference between an intraperitoneal organ and an extraperitoneal organ. After that, we will describe the retroperitoneal spaces. And then we'll name the abdominal organs which are found in each of those retroperitoneal spaces. And lastly, we will talk about the components of the posterior abdominal wall. So let's start straight ahead with the first objective, organization of the peritoneum. By definition, the peritoneum is a serous membrane that line the abdominal cavity. Typically just a serous membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. This membrane may be lining the actual wall of the abdominal cavity, or it may be lining the various organs within the abdominal cavity. Because it lines organs, we expect it therefore to be folded many times. And so there are many places where the peritoneum is actually folded according to the folds of the organs or according to where those organs are found. All in all, we can describe the peritoneum as consisting of two layers. The layer of the peritoneum that lines the abdominal wall, or the organs which are applied to the abdominal wall. In this image, that red layer is what we call the parietal layer of the peritoneum. So understand that the parietal layer of the peritoneum line the abdominal wall, whether anterior, lateral, posterior, superior, or inferior. It will line the abdominal wall. But it also lines the abdominal organs which are applied onto those walls. Like here, this is still parietal peritoneum because it is lining this organ that is applied to the posterior abdominal wall. And this is still parietal peritoneum because it's still lining the abdominal wall, abdominal organ that's applied to the wall inferior in this case. Then we have what we call the visceral layer of the peritoneum. The visceral layer of the peritoneum is the one represented by the blue here. This is the one that line the abdominal organs and suspend them. Like in this case, perhaps this is an intestine, or that one, or this one is a stomach. The organs which line and suspend the abdominal organs is the layer of the peritoneum that line and suspend the abdominal organs is what we call the visceral layer of the peritoneum. So understand that the red one here represents the parietal layer and the blue represents the visceral layer of the peritoneum. Even in this other image, in a cross section, the red one here represents the parietal layer of the peritoneum, and the blue here represents the visceral layer of the peritoneum. Importantly, therefore, the suspension that is created by the visceral layer of the peritoneum, as we can see here, is what we call the mesentery. So the mesentery is a double layer of the visceral peritoneum that suspend the abdominal organs. Histologically, what is the peritoneum? Histologically, the peritoneum is a single layer of simple squamous epithelial cells, and that's what we call mesothelium. But deep to that mesothelium is a loose connective tissue region, which we call the subserosal connective tissue. You can call it submesothelial connective tissue. That subserosal or submesothelial connective tissue practically contain a number of fat cells, as we can see here, lymphatic tissue, as we can see in this one, perhaps a blood vessel like that one, and different cell types indeed, which are cell types of the immune system. Okay. Having said that, we have the peritoneum. So the region of the abdomen that is enclosed by the peritoneal lining is what we are called the peritoneal cavity. If you understand that you have an abdominal cavity, then there's a membrane within that cavity, although highly folded, but it's there. So the region of the abdomen that is enclosed, the chamber that is enclosed by the peritoneum, is what are called the peritoneal cavity. Basically, there are two cavities. There are two peritoneal cavities within the abdomen. There's what we call the greater sac, and there's what we call the lesser sac. The greater sac, as the name suggests, is a larger space, and is the one that I'm demonstrating right now. So that's the greater sac of the peritoneal cavity. Then there's what we call the lesser sac of the peritoneal cavity. The lesser sac of the peritoneal cavity is this one here. Usually, the lesser sac is also called the omental bursa, and it is behind the stomach. So there's that cavity which we call the lesser sac. Then there's the cavity that we call the greater sac. The only communication between the two sacs is somewhere near the liver. There's an opening which shows to it that the larger and the smaller sacs are in communication. That opening is called the epiploic foramen, or otherwise known as the foramen of Winslow. So that's the only communication between the lesser sac, which is also called omental bursa, and the greater sac. Remember, these are chambers enclosed by the peritoneum. Having talked about what peritoneum is and what peritoneal cavity is, now let's make a distinction between an intraperitoneal organ and an extraperitoneal organ. So I've told you that the peritoneum lines organs. The parietal peritoneum will line organs which are applied to the wall of the abdomen. The visceral peritoneum will line organs which are suspended within the abdomen. these organs are suspended by a double fold of the mesentery, a double fold of the visceral peritoneum. And that double fold of the visceral peritoneum is what we call the mesentery. So there are some two terminologies here that we need to understand. The term intraperitoneal and the term extraperitoneal, and perhaps the term retroperitoneal. Let's start with intraperitoneal organ. What is an intraperitoneal organ? An intraperitoneal organ is an organ that is lined by visceral layer of the peritoneum. Any organ that is lined by the visceral layer of the peritoneum is considered intraperitoneal. And so therefore, in most cases, if an organ is lined by the visceral peritoneum, that organ in most cases will also be having a layer of visceral peritoneum that suspend it, what we call the mesentery. So any organ that has a mesentery is definitely intraperitoneal. For example, here, this is the stomach. We can see two layers of the visceral peritoneum. And at that point, that's mesentery. This is also mesentery. This is mesentery for this would be the transverse colon. Maybe this would be the small intestine. So this is still mesentery. So any organ that is lined by visceral peritoneum is intraperitoneal. Therefore, we can name some of the intraperitoneal organs. You most likely have already done them. Stomach, transverse colon, jejunum, ileum, and the like. They are intraperitoneal because they are fully covered by visceral peritoneum. And indeed, that visceral peritoneum form a double layer of itself, which we call the mesentery, that suspend those organs. So having said so, it's easier then to describe what is extraperitoneal. As the name suggests, extraperitoneal would mean an organ that is outside the peritoneum. Let's use that term to refer to organs which are not lined by visceral peritoneum. So those ones are extraperitoneal. If they're not lined by visceral peritoneum, then they are extraperitoneal. Now, tailored to that is the term retroperitoneal. Retro alludes to the fact that it is behind. So a retroperitoneal organ is definitely an extraperitoneal organ. However, not all extraperitoneal organs would be retroperitoneal, but we would expect all retroperitoneal organs to be extraperitoneal. And I hope you now understand. So retro here simply refers to the extraperitoneal organs which are behind the peritoneum. In simple terms, that between the paratoperitoneum and the posterior abdominal wall. Those are the ones which are retroperitoneal. But if you are extraperitoneal, it simply means you are not lined by the visceral peritoneum, irrespective of where that organ is. For example, here now, we can see the bladder is basically extraperitoneal. However, we can say that the bladder here is retroperitoneal. So having explained that, let's now talk about the retroperitoneal spaces. We will take this chance to also name the organs which are found in each of the spaces. Perhaps this way we are going to take more time then. So start by defining the retroperitoneum. The retroperitoneum is that part of the abdominal cavity that lies between the posterior Peritoneum, which means the Peritoneum which is posterior. If you follow this one here, okay, so let's follow this peritoneum, this one. This is the Peritoneum, but that's the anterior Peritoneum. Now let's follow it this way. So this would be the posterior Peritoneum. So this space between the posterior Peritoneum, which is this one, and the posterior abdominal wall, which is this region here. That region is what you're calling the Retroperitoneum. If you remember the layers that form the anterior abdominal wall, we talked about skin, then superficial fascia, which is made up of the fatty layer, and then the membranous layer. Then we talked about the layer of muscles. After layer of muscles, we mentioned this fascia, the fascia transversalis. So transversalis fascia is the innermost layer of the posterior abdominal wall. Therefore, that space between the transversalis fascia and the posterior Peritoneum, that space is what you're calling the Retroperitoneum. Clinically, the Retroperitoneum is divided into 4 potential spaces. And these 4 potential spaces contain different retroperitoneal organs. So I want us to go through each of the potential spaces of the Retroperitoneum. And I want us to then name the organs which are found in each space of the Retroperitoneum. But let's have this diagram to just illustrate something. The black line here represents the parietal layer of the peritoneum, but this is where I would then call the anterior parietal peritoneum. Follow the anterior parietal peritoneum, and so you'll agree with me that then this would be called the posterior parietal peritoneum. So that's the posterior parietal peritoneum. And this other one is the anterior parietal peritoneum. You can confirm the presence of the other layers of the anterior abdominal wall. See the 3 muscles there. Then behind that is the fascia transversalis. Let's follow the fascia transversalis. So here they are very intimate with the peritoneum. But when you go behind here, the parietal layer of the peritoneum and the fascia transversalis somewhat split. And so we see a big gap between the 2 layers. And between those 2 layers, within that big gap, we see several organs. So this region here is what we are calling the retroperitoneum. That space between the parietal layer of the peritoneum posteriorly and the fascia transversalis. Again, then you can appreciate therefore that the peritoneum is the anterior wall of the retroperitoneum, and fascia transversalis is the posterior wall of the retroperitoneum. So this retroperitoneal space is divided into other 4 spaces. These 4 spaces are potential spaces. They contain some organs, some of them, and we're going to name them. But what helped to divide them into the spaces? There's some fascia that go around the kidney that tells you that kidneys are among the organs which are retroperitoneal. There's some fascia that go around the kidney that help to divide these spaces. 2 of these fascia are important in helping us define the spaces. So in the image to your right, we can use that to then explain to us the spaces we want to talk about. Consider this to be the region where the kidney is. So there's a fascia that is running anterior to the kidney. We call it the anterior pararenal. Sorry, the anterior renal fascia. So that's the anterior renal fascia, also known as the Gerota's fascia. And then you have the posterior renal fascia, which is also known as the Zuckerland's fascia. So we are using the anterior renal fascia and the posterior renal fascia to divide the retroperitoneal space at this point into three of them: the anterior pararenal space, perirenal space, and posterior pararenal space. But there's another space between the right and the left perirenal space. So that would be somewhere here that we're also going to give a name to. In this case, this is the region there. We're going to give a name to that one. And that's why I told you there are 4 potential spaces. So let's start with the first space, the anterior pararenal space. Don't confuse the spaces with the fascia. Let's try figuring out the boundaries of the anterior pararenal space from this image. So this layer here is the posterior layer of the Peritoneum, or the posterior part of the Peritoneum. And that forms the anterior boundary of the Retroperitoneum. Then this other fascia here, albeit the fact that it's split into 2, is the anterior pararenal, the anterior renal fascia. So this is the anterior renal fascia. The space between the anterior renal fascia and the Peritoneum, this space here, is what we are calling the anterior pararenal space. So in this image, this is the Peritoneum, and this is the anterior renal fascia. So these organs within here are being considered to be within the anterior pararenal space. In that case, what are the contents of the anterior pararenal space? The anterior pararenal space contains the pancreas. You'll remember that this is a mixed organ, both endocrine and exocrine functions. The endocrine component of the pancreas refer to clusters of cells which produce hormones. We call them the islets of Langerhans, and they release hormones to the bloodstream, things like insulin, glucagon, and the like. The exocrine component of the pancreas is made up of the pancreatic acini, which produce pancreatic juice into the pancreatic ducts, and that juice is then released into the second part of the duodenum. So the other organ which is found within the anterior pararenal space is the duodenum itself. Remember, duodenum is the first component, the small intestine, that comes from the stomach. Ideally, the duodenum has 4 segments: D1, D2, D3, and D4. And the common bile duct, as well as the pancreatic duct, open into the second part of the duodenum, what we call the D2. We have ascending colon as well as descending colon, also being in the anterior pararenal space. These are the key contents of the anterior pararenal space. But you can never go wrong with lymph nodes and fatty tissue. They are found almost in every space. Okay, the second space I want us to talk about is the perirenal space. As the name suggests, this is the space around the kidney. So the perirenal space will be between the anterior and the posterior renal fascia. between the anterior and posterior renal fascia, that's where you're going to have the perirenal space. So what does the perirenal space contain? Of course, the kidneys are contained here. We also have the blood vessels which supply the kidney. We call them renal vessels. We have the adrenal glands. Remember, adrenal glands are endocrine glands located on upper pole of each kidney. The adrenal glands each have a cortex and a medulla. The adrenal cortex produces hormones which are steroid in nature, so we call them corticosteroids. From 3 zones of the adrenal cortex, we have 3 different kinds of hormonal secretions. Mineralocorticoids from zona glomerulosa, glucocorticoids from the zona fasciculata, and the last one are androgens from the zona reticularis. That's the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla contains chromaffin cells, which secrete adrenaline and noradrenaline to some extent. The proximal parts of the ureters are also found within the perirenal space. And as we agreed, you can never go wrong with some lymph nodes and fatty tissue. I have intentionally talked less about anything renal because that will be the next big topic, to talk about anatomy of the urinary system. And so we'll talk much about the anatomy of the kidneys and perhaps the ureters in the next class. The third retroperitoneal space to talk about is the posterior pararenal space. We will consider the posterior pararenal space as the space between the posterior renal fascia and fascia transversalis. So basically somewhere there. So that space between the posterior renal fascia and fascia transversalis simply contain fatty tissue and nothing much. So largely fatty tissue. So that becomes a really, really potential space. Right, the fourth space to talk about, and this is a relatively newer concept, is a great vessel space. The great vessel space is this region here, the space between the right and the left perirenal space. So that space between the right and the left perirenal space is what we call the great vessel space. It extends from around the level of the 12th thoracic vertebra up to the level of the 4th or 5th lumbar vertebra. This is a space that contains the abdominal aorta. Remember, abdominal aorta is an extension of the descending thoracic aorta. It enters the abdomen through the aortic opening of the diaphragm, which is at around the level of T12. When it enters the abdomen, it gives branches. You can classify the branches of the abdominal aorta into anterior branches, into paired branches, and perhaps terminal branches. The anterior branches are the ones which go to the digestive system. So we have the celiac trunk, which supplies the foregut, superior mesenteric artery, which supplies the midgut, and inferior mesenteric artery, which supplies the hindgut. Apart from the anterior branches which go to the digestive system, we also have some paired branches, which means there's right and left. And a number of paired branches can be mentioned at this point. We have the renal arteries themselves, which go to supply the kidneys. We have the suprarenal arteries, which supply the adrenal glands. We have the gonadal arteries, which can either be ovarian or testicular artery, supplying the respective gonad. We have lumbar arteries. Lumbar arteries are similar to the posterior intercostal arteries in the thorax. The lumbar arteries supply the posterior abdominal wall largely. Then we have the right and left common iliac arteries. The right and left common iliac arteries are paired arteries, but they're also terminal branches of the abdominal aorta. So generally, the aorta bifurcates at around the fourth lumbar vertebra, where it divides into the right and left common iliac artery. Apart from aorta, we also have the inferior vena cava running to the right of the aorta. The inferior vena cava is formed by union of the right and left common iliac veins. This union commonly takes place at the level of the fifth lumbar vertebra to the right of the aorta. The inferior vena cava then receives various tributaries. It receives the lumbar veins. It receives the right gonadal veins. Now remember, the left one doesn't join directly. The left gonadal vein joins the left renal vein. But then both renal veins also join the inferior vena cava, so you can mention that. The inferior vena cava also receives the veins from the liver, which we call the hepatic veins. Then there are some lymph nodes which run on either side of the aorta, so we can call them para-aortic nodes. But there are also those lymph nodes which run in front of the aorta, so we call them pre-aortic nodes. The para-aortic nodes are the nodes which are related to the paired arteries. So you'll have one on either side. The pre-aortic nodes are the ones related to the anterior branches of the aorta. So the nodes will be basically in front of the aorta, pre-aortic and para-aortic lymph nodes. Right. There's another space that sometimes can be mentioned, although I don't really consider it a retroperitoneal space based on the definition of what is the retroperitoneum. We agree that retroperitoneum refers to the space between the posterior paratoperitoneum and the posterior fascia transversalis. Now that's the retroperitoneum. And so if we have something else beyond that one, that is not retroperitoneum. And so this other space that can be mentioned is the muscular space, the space that contains the mass of the posterior abdominal wall. Generally, it's not retroperitoneum, and so we can ignore about it. But now let's talk about the posterior abdominal wall. Now, the images we are looking here are images of the posterior abdominal wall. To your left, showing us the muscles that form the posterior abdominal wall. And to your right, a cross-section of the same. The idea here is to appreciate the muscles that form the posterior abdominal wall. So the following muscles form the posterior abdominal wall. We have the posterior dome of the thoracic diaphragm. Then we have the transversus abdominis muscle. We have the quadratus lumborum muscle. We have the psoas muscle. You may have psoas major and psoas minor, though not everyone has a psoas minor. Then lastly, we have the iliacus muscle. So the muscle iliacus, psoas major and minor, quadratus lumborum, transversus abdominis, and posterior dome of the thoracic diaphragm. All those constitute the posterior abdominal wall. And basically, those are the muscles that form the wall. So with that, I think we'll stop there. I hope that you've understood something about retroperitoneum and the posterior abdominal wall. So thank you very much. Your next lecture should now be targeting the anatomy of the urinary system.